I watched a video by Cuck Philosophy on cultural schizophrenia, where he differentiated between Marxists and postmodernists. So, a Marxist looks at capitalism and says that capitalism creates alienation. Capitalism breaks down bonds, psychological bonds. Capitalism does damage to people, and so the solution to capitalism is to come up with an ethical structure that we can then impose on the world to prevent the abuses of capitalism. And this ethic structure, the structure of ethics is then called communism or socialism or social justice or egalitarianism or equality or social democracy or some variation. Sometimes it extends into anarchism and says that the ultimate goal is we should have a system that prevents not just capitalism, but any form of state power, any form of hierarchy. So the postmodernist recognizes that capitalism abuses people, that capitalism is a system of winners and losers. But then the postmodernists can look at communism itself and see that communism is an ethical structure, and note that capitalism cannot exist without an ethical structure. So the most basic ethical precept of capitalism is property rights. And property rights cannot exist in a state of chaos. Capitalism requires stability to exist. This stability has to come from somewhere. It either comes from an ethnic culture, it comes from a civic nationalism, it comes from a religion, it comes from a sense of civilization. So Europe can have a market because Europe has civilizational-wide norms. Europe can have a market because, or formerly it could have a market because it was considered Christendom, and Christendom had religion-wide norms. So you have to have a metacultural structure if you want to have a market that acts between cultures. So in order for global capitalism to exist, you need a global ethical cultural structure. And that's where communism comes in. Communism fulfills the mission of creating a global ethical structure. And communism does this with human rights, with feminism, with pacifism, with atheism and secularism, breaking down the particularities between people. You declare religion to be worthless, you declare ethnicity to be worthless, nationality to be worthless, lineage and ancestry to be worthless. You devalue these things, you debunk them, you deconstruct them, and that allows for a new system of ethics called humanism, globalism, social justice, global citizenship to come in and to provide a global structure for property rights that allows Europe to have free trade with China and with India and with Russia and South America and Africa. And this is what Marxists call neocolonialism, because now it's no longer the British Empire colonizing India, but it's a million different multinational corporations, and there are a million different shareholders. Anyone who participates in the stock market, really anyone who participates in the economy at all, is participating in the exploitation of India and the people there under neocolonialism, under capitalism. But this global capitalist system, this system of global exploitation, this neocolonialism, is not possible without humanist, secularist, communist ethics. You need that universal system of ethics in order for a global system of property rights to emerge. Now, if we want to talk about the origins of secularism, we might go to Henry VIII and his dissolution of the monasteries, which began in 1536. And I would also say that this dissolution of the monasteries was a beginning of capitalism. Now, my definition of capitalism is much broader than the Marxist definition, because the Marxist makes a distinction between capitalist and communist states. I don't. I say that a communist state is a particular kind of capitalist state. Because my concern here is with mythology. My concern is not the day-to-day structure of government. My concern is not with the titles of government. My concern is not with the appearance of the government. My concern is not with the justifications or the explanations. My concern is with the myths and the ethics and what objects are held to be the greatest value. And in a capitalist system, the objects of greatest value are capital, and capital is any good or anything which is valuable which can be transferred through trade. So a stock is capital, land is capital, a factory is capital, a worker can even be considered capital. So a company can pay a worker, and essentially, I think Marxists have a point when they say wage slavery, because you're compensating, you're paying someone, you're loaning them in the same way that a slave trader would buy a slave for $500. Well, now he owns that slave for the rest of his life. Before the Atlantic slave trade, you had serfdom. And so you could buy and sell human beings as indentured servants for a period of time or for a lifetime. This goes back to ancient Rome. And further, with the Israelites, and since the beginning of conquest, basically, people were enslaving each other. And so the concept of buying and selling people, well, the capitalist says that's inefficient. I don't want to buy a laborer for the entire duration of his lifespan. I only need a year of his time, or I only need 8 hours a day of his time. And that way I can cut down on my costs. I don't have to pay him as much. I don't have to house him. I don't have to clothe him. I don't have to feed them. Remember, if you were a lord, you were responsible for the housing and clothing and feeding. If you were a slave master, you were responsible for the housing, the clothing, the feeding of your slaves. That's much more expensive than actually what ended up. The system that came after slavery in America was called sharecropping. You no longer had to house and clothe and feed the slaves. You simply had to pay them for their hourly labor. And Marxists have come along and said, well, the transition from slavery to sharecropping really was not an end of slavery, but it was a move from a situation in which you were owning the slave for the duration of the slave's lifetime versus you're owning the slave for the duration of paid labor. And that's the concept of wage slavery. And I think that there's something to that concept. There's something to that perspective. Now, to get back to what I was saying here, the capitalist economy says that the most important thing is capital. It's that which we can trade. So your ancestry is not important because you can't trade it. Your gender is not important because you cannot trade your gender. Your lineage is not important because you can't trade your lineage. So anything which is not tradable in a marketplace that you can trade back and forth, like a stock or labor or factory or resource, you can't trade it back and forth. You can't trade it at a margin. You can't, it's not like a currency, you can't manipulate it, you can't charge interest on it. If it's not capital, it doesn't matter. That's the ethos of capitalism, and that's the same exact ethos as communism. Communism states that the most important thing in society is capital, and a person's access to capital determines whether or not they have a good life or a bad life. And so the moral thing to do is to give everyone equal access to capital, to say that the workers should own the means of production, that is, the workers should own the capital. And so communism is totally focused on tradable goods, tradable services, tradable value. Anything that's tradable, they're concerned with that, and they're concerned about the distribution of that. So in that sense, all communists are capitalists because they're only looking at that which is tradable, that which is capital. So a communist is just a particular kind of capitalist, and this is clear if you read Marx. He was in favor of free trade. He was in favor of capitalism. He just said, we have to take this system, we have to provide ethics for it that essentially negate the necessity of Christendom. They negate the necessity of European civilization. They negate these necessities. They negate the necessity of gender norms. They negate these necessities because we're going to create a universal, global system of ethics that's applicable no matter what culture, no matter what gender, no matter what religion. It's completely secular, it's completely androgynous, and it's completely transnational or anti-national. And so communism is a prerequisite, or the communist ethic, all this humanism, secularism, feminism, that is a prerequisite for global capitalism, because without the ethic, without the concept of human rights, you can't have a global market. You can't have global property rights if there's no metacultural law that governs the interactions between different markets on an international scale. So capitalism and communism are really dependent on one another, and we see this going back to the dissolution of the monarchies or monasteries in 1536 by Henry VIII, and that's sort of the beginning of secularism in England, because it devalues the tradition of the church. It devalues, it says, well, religion is something that we can just decree to be false or true. And it's in the power, one man has the power to declare, oh, I've decided because I want to divorce my wife that's okay now. The autocracy of the individual, the individualism, that's where the classical liberal culture comes from, that's where secularism comes from, that's where capitalism comes from, that's where communism comes from. Now, when I talk about Henry VIII, let's see if I can balance here. When I talk about Henry VIII and I talk about this being the origin of capitalism, communism, secularism, humanism, and the modern world, really, I'm talking about a great replacement. I'm talking about a great replacement of the Christian tradition. I'm talking about a great replacement of the European tradition. I'm talking about a great replacement of the feudal system. And so when people talk about the great replacement of 1965, or the great demographic replacement happening in Europe or America, I think that's just one more symptom, one more consequence of a great replacement of feudalism with capitalism that happened with Henry VIII. Now, that could happen at other places and other times, and in fact, we could look at Rome, and we could look at Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar became dictator through a number of military conquests and victories. He amassed power, he amassed wealth, and he became dictator. And previously, the ruling body in Rome was the Senate. And the Senate and the senators were men of aristocratic lineage. And so power in Rome was centered on these powerful aristocratic families, these lineages, who then formed the Senate, and they had the power to make laws, to change laws, to appoint, ministers, to get rid of people. They had the power. It was a republic. Caesar changed it to be an empire. He changed it so that he was dictator, and it never reverted to a republic. But when the senators were in power, it was an aristocratic feudal system. When Julius Caesar came to power, he started packing the Senate. That is, the Senate was previously made up of aristocratic Roman families. It was made up of families who were as old as Rome itself, essentially. Original Roman families going back, the Latins, the 7 hills of Rome and everything. Very old families, very ancient families. Being a senator was not necessarily something you could trade. It was not something you could buy. It was something you inherited. And therefore we could say that prior to Caesar, the Roman system was a feudal system. It was based on ancestry, it was based on lineage. Power was something you inherited. It's not something you earned. It's not something that you could trade or give away. If you came into hard times, if you went into debt, you couldn't sell your senatorial title to someone else and make them a senator. But what Julius Caesar did is he changed the Senate qualitatively and quantitatively. He packed it with his supporters, whether they were aristocratic or not, whether they were Roman or not. And so he brought Gauls into the Senate. Now, people like to talk about, again, it's very funny how people are always concerned with the conclusion. They're not concerned with the process. They're not concerned with how we got here. They're just concerned with the conclusion, and they conflate the conclusions with the process itself. So people will say, oh, 1965, that was the start of the Great Replacement. And ever since 1965, we've been flooded with the Third World, and that's destroying the West. And if we could just go back to 1964, everything would be fine. What I'm saying is that the Great Replacement began when Henry VIII said, church land is no longer non-capital. I'm making it capital. Church land is no longer something that is basically property of the church, or it's no longer theocratic, but now church land is to be governed by capitalism. It's to be bought and sold. Land in general, as a consequence, became a thing which was not inherited, it was not aristocratic, it was bought and sold. And so if you're a rich merchant, you could be from Galatia, you could be from Berlin, you could be from anywhere, you could have any kind of religious or cultural background. If you can succeed as a merchant, if you can succeed scamming people, selling things at margin, charging interest, you can buy land, you can become an aristocrat, and then the aristocracy meant nothing, because if you can just buy land to become an aristocrat, then there's no meaning to the aristocracy anymore. There's no distinction between aristocrat and commoner. The only thing that determines your social position is wealth and your ability to accumulate wealth. And so society goes from being a warrior aristocracy to a merchant-ruled society. That is the replacement that happened. It's not the replacement. People say, oh, well, white people are being replaced by third worlders or something, as if that was the beginning of the story. In the beginning, Hart-Celler-Act. That wasn't the beginning. That's the end of the story, not the beginning of the story. The beginning of the Great Replacement is 1536, where a warrior elite, or all the aristocrats, were descended from people who had won battles. The aristocracy was founded and maintained through warfare. In 1536, that begins the Great Replacement. That begins the replacement of a warrior aristocracy with a merchant-led society. So it's the change in leadership that really leads to, finally, now we're having as a consequence, change in demographics, change in composition of the society at large. Now, there have been replacements of the population before. If you think about it, if the aristocracy, if they're having 10 kids each, and the peasantry are having 8 kids, but those, 4 of those 8 kids are going to die because of disease, and 2 of them are going to die to violence, and so basically the peasantry is barely maintaining itself. It's barely at replacement rate as far as fertility. The aristocracy outbreeds the lower classes, and you replace all the people in the lower classes with upper class descended people. That's why all Europeans, or most of them, are descended from Charlemagne. Charlemagne had sons became kings became dukes became princes. They married everybody, they all incestuously married each other, and then they had way more kids than the average peasant. They replaced the average peasant, or they married into the peasantry, essentially, as you could descend down. There was a certain degree of upward mobility, in terms of if you were a peasant and you fought in an army, you could be knighted or you could become a squire. There were some forms of upward mobility, but what happened much more often was downward mobility, that you would be, because of primogeniture means that the eldest son gets everything. So you have a lord, and his eldest son inherits the land. It's not split up, it's not divided. The oldest son inherits everything. So what do the other sons do? Well, it's not that they're poor, but they have much less resources. They have to fend for themselves, and they might go bankrupt, and they might move down the social ladder and eventually end up mixing in with the peasantry. So great replacements happen all the time. Demographic replacements happen all the time in history. There are consequences of the structure, the ethical structure of society, the metacultural structure of society. So this is the start of capitalism, this is the start of communism, this is the start of secularism. And it happened before. It didn't just happen in 1536. That wasn't a unique phenomenon. It happened with Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar took the power structure of Rome, which was the Senate, which was previously determined by lineage, by ancestry. He replaced that. He began a great replacement in the Senate. Rather than the Senate being full of aristocrats and lords, he brought in Gauls. He brought in military men. He brought in all kinds of people who were not part of the original power structure of Rome. Now, what people like to say is that, 1965 or mass immigration today is very similar to how the Germans invaded Rome. The Germans came down and they invaded Rome, and we're being invaded by the third world. It's the same exact thing. The problem is they don't look at the events which preceded this hundreds of years before. When Caesar packed the Senate with Gauls, he set a precedent that Rome was no longer to be ruled by Romans, but Rome was an international corporation with franchises all over the Mediterranean, and anyone could be a Roman senator. And so the title of senator lost its meaning, lost its significance. It became a thing that could be bought and sold for various favors. You could be made a senator. Now, this was a process. It didn't just happen all at once with Julius Caesar. It wasn't a black and white process, something that happened slowly over time. In the same way you can look at, with Henry VIII, you can look at a precedent, for instance, when the Normans invaded, they set up various church properties, and over time there were controversies between the crown of England versus the crown of France, and who was who, and there were contests for the throne, and so you had various monasteries that were aligned with France, but they were located in England, and vice versa. And the consequence of that was that certain monastic properties were expropriated. So there were precedents for what was happening. There were precedents. We could talk about the investiture contest in Germany as an example of a case where an emperor, Henry IV actually, or Heinrich IV, decided that he wanted to be the one to appoint bishops, and the Pope said, no, we appoint the bishops, not you. This was a contest. There were bishops on both sides. There were bishops who favored the emperor. There were bishops who favored the Pope. It was a contest. Now, the Pope ultimately won that specific battle. It was a back and forth. But overall, eventually Henry VIII, 400 years later, so on, he succeeds over the Pope. He finally gets his way, possibly for geographical reasons, that it's hard to invade England, and so the Pope, it'd be hard for him to launch a crusade against England and Henry VIII. But he's able to succeed nonetheless, and his victory over the church breaks the infallibility of the church. It breaks the continuity of the church. It breaks the cohesion of the church in Europe at large. And that crack in the armor allows for the church to be devalued over time, and it allows for the rise of capitalism, the rise of communism, which supports global capitalism. And this has happened before. It happened with Caesar packing the Senate with foreigners and mercenaries and people who were not of an aristocratic lineage. And that led directly to the fall of Rome and the invasions of the Germans. Now, the question is this an evil thing or a good thing? I'm simply stating it descriptively as this is something that I see happening twice in history, that you have Julius Caesar packs the Senate, 300 years or 500 years later, you have the fall of Rome. Between 300 and 500 AD, you have the fall of Rome. Okay, well, Henry VIII dissolves the monasteries, allows commoners to buy aristocratic properties. Okay, 300 to 500 years later, we have secularism, modernism, nihilism, atheism, and the collapse of the West. So, in our case, I think part of it is perhaps the rise in literacy compared with Rome, but we seem to be much more ideological. We seem to be much more dogmatic, and part of that might be because of Christianity and the legacy of scholasticism. That when I look at the history of Western civilization, or what Spengler calls Faustian civilization, basically when we talk about the medieval-led Germanic system that comes after Rome, after the Scholastic period and after the defeat of the Arians, that's not Arians, but the followers of Arius, who were not Trinitarians, after the church becomes more dogmatized, after the defeat of the Vikings, after the defeat of the pagans, when Christianity becomes uncontested in Europe, at least in Northern Europe, it's contested in Spain, it's contested in the Balkans, it's contested in Malta and Sicily and places like that. But in Northern Europe, Christianity becomes uncontested, and then there's this dogmatism. And so ideology becomes much more important. Whereas in Rome, it's sort of this gradual transition where, Gracchus, the Gracchus brothers come along and they try to institute social reforms that are called proto-communist, redistribution of the land. The problem is the Gracchus brothers never wrote the Gracchus Manifesto or the Proto-Communist Manifesto. They didn't make it something ideological. They didn't make like a secular religion out of it. It was an idea. It was a popular idea, but the collapse of Rome, we can't as neatly divide it into, okay, well, first there was the ideology of secularism, and then we had nihilism, and then we had communism, and then we had neoliberalism. We can't do that as neatly with Rome, and I think part of that is due to the pagan roots of Rome, which didn't really change until the collapse of Rome was right around the corner, around 300 AD with Constantine, 500 AD. The pagan religious tradition was much more rooted in ancestry, and it was much less ideological. And so in a sense, what Joel Davis is trying to introduce with this anti-ideological concept of postmodernism is, to me, strikes me as very pagan, because you're saying that we need to get beyond ideological thinking. We need to get beyond dogmatic thinking. But that's something, if we compare Rome to post-medieval Europe is much more ideological, it's much more dogmatic, and so the collapse, you can say, oh, well, first we had Marxism, and then we had feminism, and then we had all these social movements that are codified and that are they're their own little secular cults. We can't really do that with Rome, and maybe part of the reason is because psychologically, if we want to talk about like the bicameral mind, the emergence of consciousness, that the Romans were not they were not as rationalist as we are. They didn't try to rationalize their internal impulses and urges. They simply sort of accepted them for what they were. We try to rationalize things like it's acceptable to enjoy blood and gore if it's in entertainment, if it's in Game of Thrones, if it's in video games, but it's unacceptable to have real life blood and gore, which is a very strange dissociation for people to make. The Romans didn't necessarily make that dissociation, although you can, of course, say, well, previously, like a proto-Roman society or a proto-Italic society probably had human sacrifices, and we see that in things like, I know in the Celtic context you had the Wicker Man, which was real human sacrifice, but in the Roman context, there were certain traditions where they would take like a doll or some kind of figurine or some kind of construct of a person and sacrifice it. And that's sort of, hearkening to a tradition of human sacrifice. So certainly the Romans were more progressive in a sense, or more further along in this kind of historical progression that I'm trying to describe here, this mechanism. They were no longer practicing human sacrifice, so they had distanced themselves from that. They were still practicing animal sacrifice, just as the Jews, we very, very clearly see in the history of the Jews that at some point, some kind of pre-Abrahamic Semitic society which preceded the Jews was practicing human sacrifice, that we know all their neighbors were practicing it. So human sacrifice then transitioned to animal sacrifice. Now most Jews today don't sacrifice animals, so then there was another transition from animal sacrifice to abstract scapegoating. We're no longer scapegoating through humans, we're no longer scapegoating through animals, so now we're going to scapegoat through abstract ideas and prayers and liturgy and dogma and ideology. So it's this move toward abstraction, and that's part of the reason why I don't think people immediately see the comparison between Julius Caesar and Henry VIII. I don't think people see that, because when we look at the progress or decline, however, whatever your perspective is, when we look at the changes in Western civilization between Henry VIII and the present day, we track the history of Western civilization mostly through ideas and the progression of ideas, and we give these ideas names and systems of ideas, conservatism versus liberalism. In Rome, we couldn't really necessarily speak of conservatism versus liberalism. It's not as clear-cut because the Romans themselves didn't think in those terms. They didn't give these kinds of ideological or abstract labels. The Romans were very centered in personality, and this is something that fascism and National Socialism tried to revive, is this feudalistic concept of personality as trumping everything else, not being ideological. Now there is a contradiction there, because National Socialism and fascism both claim to be ideologies. However, there was within those ideologies a concept, at least in the German, the leader principle, or Führerprinzip, and that is the concept that the ultimate decider in politics should not be ideological consistency, it shouldn't be dogma, it shouldn't be abstract principles, but it should be the decision of leaders, it should be the decisions of individuals. And this was their critique of parliamentarianism, is that parliamentarianism, if a mistake was made, who do you blame? There are way too many people in Parliament, and they're coming in Parliament, they're getting voted out of Parliament, so there's no responsibility. The buck doesn't stop with any individual. And so that's why they said we need to reintroduce the principle of personality, that the person and the individual, the leader, is ultimately responsible for decisions and therefore has the power, rather than a dogma or an ideology or something like that. Not to say that they didn't have an ideological structure, but they were trying to shift power away from decisions being made by systems toward decisions being made by people, and creating a system like that. I mean, there was a concept of, emulating the papacy, or emulating, the Venetian Republic, and saying we're going to have like 100 senators, and they're going to elect some leader, and it's going to be a secret election. But then once that leader's in place, that leader has infallibility, and they viewed that as a good system. It was never implemented, but you can see how that system has repeated itself over and over again throughout history, and you could say it's even based on the Roman system. So they're trying to go back to that. So I don't know. That's the comparisons I have today. I mean, which system is better? Is the approach of, post Julius Caesar, packing the Senate, international Rome, anyone could be a Roman citizen, anyone could be a Roman senator? Is that the better approach? Global capitalism, is that the better approach? What are we going for? What's our goal here? What are we interested in? Are we interested in systems that produce the greatest amount of capital? Or are we interested in systems that value personhood and leadership and individual virtues, or sacred objects, a theocratic system, or is it a military aristocracy? Is it, what kind of system do we want here? That's a hard question to answer because a lot of it has to do with our individual identities. So if you're in a position where you feel like your identity, you're losing power, then you would prefer a system of inheritance. You would prefer a system of tradition over a system of evolution, over a system of capitalism. Because capitalism allows you to have upward mobility. It allows you to strip away old traditions and to go into something new. And maybe to close this up, I'll just say that postmodernism, or the idea of postmodernists, was that communists are feeding into the system of capitalism by providing it with the social and ethical structures to maintain global capitalism. Communism and social justice and humanism and human rights, they're all feeding into this structure of global capitalism. And the idea, at least explained by Cuck philosophy, him explaining Deleuze, I haven't read Deleuze, but the way he explained it was that Deleuze was an accelerationist, and Deleuze said that we cannot solve the problems of capitalism, or we can't replace capitalism with communism. Communism will only feed into capitalism. Communism will only establish international norms which allow capitalism to globalize itself and to dominate everything, to universalize. So to defeat capitalism, we can't do that with communism. We actually have to defeat capitalism with capitalism. We have to push capitalism to the extreme. We have to make it so adaptive, so evolutionary, so dynamic. And we have to create so many changes so fast. We have to strip all ethics from society. We have to go into a total nihilism where there are no values, to the point where property norms are no longer sustainable. That society is so unstable that capitalism breaks, and then something new comes along to replace it, which would be something like a Germanic invasion of late Rome, or it would be something like the reestablishment of feudalism. Now, postmodernists don't usually say that. They usually, no, it's going to be anarchism, or it's going to be communism, or it's going to be something like that. But they say the way to achieve the new system is to take the contradictions of the current system, the cultural schizophrenia, and to push those to their limits, to accelerate so fast that the system cannot self-correct. It can't introduce more communist norms. It can't reinforce those communist norms. We're going to use capitalism to destroy the foundations of global capitalism, which are humanism, secularism. We're going to critique human rights as, why do we care about human rights? Why do we care about respecting private property? Why do we care about anything? Now, it's sort of doubtful that you can do that. From my perspective, it seems like global communism, what people refer to as cultural Marxism, being humanism, feminism, secularism, human rights in general do have enough power, I think, to be a stable system. I don't look at it, at least right now, I don't see that as inviable. I see that as a viable solution to the problem of capitalism, which is how do you create norms so that you can have a market, because without norms you can't have a market. So if we want a global market, we need global norms. And humanism, secularism, human rights, this seems to be a viable solution. Now maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to be a viable solution. And by viable, I don't mean that white men are going to benefit. I don't mean that there won't be winners and losers. I don't mean that people won't be abused. I don't mean that people won't be exploited, that people won't suffer. But it seems to me to be a sustainable system. It seems to be a system that people are buying into the world over. And so to me, it doesn't seem, I guess I would disagree with the postmodernists and the accelerationists who say, oh yeah, we can just take this nihilism that allowed us to transition from a feudalistic society to a capitalist society. We can take that nihilism, we can take that devaluing of theocracy, that devaluing of aristocracy, and we can further that process of devaluation and deconstruction to deconstruct the concept of property rights. And that's either going to get us to an anarchist place, or it's going to get us to a neo-feudalist fascist place. So neither of those seem to me to be very likely. What I think is more likely is that the system of capitalism will create a new genetic structure. Now, that might be using DNA, it might be using computer programs. I don't know whether it's going to be easier to augment human intelligence or whether it's going to be easier to augment artificial intelligence. But I think when we reach a point that a higher intelligence than humanity appears on the scene, that is when capitalism as we know it will be fundamentally transformed. And the ethics of human rights are going to disappear. These ethics of human rights are going to become obsolete when they're faced with the power of a higher intelligence. This higher intelligence is going to wipe out I don't know if it'll wipe out humanity, but certainly the concept of human rights will become meaningless because humanity will not be a threat to this higher intelligence. And this higher intelligence will reinstate something that would be ethically closer to aristocracy or to theocracy or something like that. It's not going to have a higher intelligence has no need for victimology. That's not necessary. That's not a necessary part of its survival strategy, because it doesn't have any irrational tendencies toward, empathy and guilt and things like that. So claiming victimhood doesn't do anything for you if you're in a highly primitive society, and it doesn't do anything for you in a higher intelligence singularity situation. It only does something for you in a situation where you have people who have developed an extreme feminine maternal empathy, and that can be abused and they can be psychologically manipulated, and it can be turned into a fashion symbol and a social signaler, and all of these irrational traits that people have that evolved for a Paleolithic context that are still carried on vestigially to the present day, that then can be manipulated in ways that they were never intended for. They didn't evolve for this purpose, but that's how they're being used now. That's all going to pass away and be obsolete when you can edit DNA or when computer programs become smarter than people. So yeah, I would disagree with postmodernists that we're going to transcend capitalism through ideology or through the deconstruction of property rights. I don't think that's viable, because I think cultural Marxism or communism, basically human rights, humanism, secularism, feminism, I think that is a viable ideological system for humanity, but I think technology is going to bring us something beyond humanity. So I don't think capitalism is forever. I don't think victimology is forever. I don't think we've reached the end of history. And I don't think the singularity would be the end of history. I don't think a higher intelligence or an artificial intelligence would be the end of history, because I think it would speciate. I think it would compete. I think it would form cultures and metacultures, systems that would compete with one another. And so history will go on. The nature of life and struggle that we see in humanity, that dynamic will continue even if humanity passes away. Just as these cultural processes that I compare between Rome and Faustian Europe or Germanic Europe, these processes run in parallel to one another, even though they're over vastly different periods of time, different geographical spaces, different ethnic composition, different genetic composition, perhaps. There's so many differences there, and yet we see similar progressions. We see these perennial cycles. So that's my big analysis of, the basically transcending, Marxists they're correct to say that capitalism is not perfect. Okay, great, you're very smart, and they do have legitimate points. If someone says, I am a capitalist and I love free market capitalist, I'm a libertarian, I'm a classical liberal, it's the best system ever, and they don't admit the flaws that it has, and they can't concede to Marxists that, yeah, you have a legitimate criticism, but our system is still better than any alternative. The problem with capitalists often, or self-identifying capitalists, is that they don't realize that global capitalism requires cultural Marxism in order to operate universally. Without a system of human rights which is culturally Marxist in its origins, you can't have global capitalism. So when capitalists say, oh, well, I understand your criticisms, but capitalism is better than the alternative. But it's like, you've integrated the alternative. Like, to me, there is no distinction between capitalism and communism. It's a false dichotomy. And they're both basically quibbling, they're both rejecting the similarity of their two ideologies, that capitalism requires communism, it relies on communism in order to survive globally, and communism requires capitalism because communism is first and foremost concerned with tradable goods of value. It's not concerned with ancestry, it's not concerned with ethnicity, so it is capital-centered. Its ethic is, it's meta-ideological, or you could even say its metaphysic is capitalist in nature. So really they're very much two sides of the same coin, and then when the postmodernist comes along and says, hey, you guys are actually very similar, capitalists and communists, they're very similar, we need to move beyond this concept of property rights in order to come to a new system. Nothing else is going to work, and we're going to do that through continuously deconstructing everything. I'm like, that level of abstraction is too much for most people to handle. It's never going to catch on. I don't think that's going to work. I think this capitalist communist fusion that we have today is here to stay, so long as something better doesn't come along. And I'm thinking that eventually something better will come along. There will be some kind of higher intelligence that's going to blow everyone else out of the water, make capitalism and communism irrelevant, and bring back a system that is formalist in nature, a system that is, neo-feudal or whatever. So this is me disagreeing with everybody and transcending everything. But I think Cuck Philosophy, he might be, I don't know how he describes himself, if he identifies as a postmodernist or a person on the left wing or whatever. But he does good presentations, so I recommend the channel. I forget where I was looking at the Roman history stuff, but maybe if I find it again, I'll recommend some more channels for you guys to watch. That's all for now. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.